One of the questions I find somewhat interesting to ask is whether or not the manosphere, however you want to define that, we can talk about that in a bit, has actually managed to change anything in terms of the landscape, in terms of the mindset, the mentality, in terms of the thoughts and perception of the world with respect to gender relations, with respect to society, etc., etc. Now, before I even begin asking this question, before I go into the details, the manosphere is a complicated topic. It's a very broad tent, so to speak. Nominally, I'm part of the manosphere, I suppose, although I don't really click with anyone in it, and never really have. I kind of just do my own thing, as many of you know. But the manosphere is indeed a broad tent, and there are all kinds of people and actors within it. Many of them, indeed, perhaps even most of them, are quite unsavory as people, to be perfectly honest. And like with any large-scale sphere online, there are a lot of very large egos at play. And these egos do a lot of work for the sake of their ego, basically. So when we talk about the manosphere, it's complicated, to say the very least. There isn't a one-shoe-size-fits-all description, and there are all kinds of people within it, many of whom simply don't agree with each other and even actively dislike each other to varying degrees. You have PUA hustler types, more traditional red pill types, you have black pill types, you have inkwells if you wish to count them, you have everything is going to collapse tomorrow, prepper types, you have everything you can imagine under the sun, really, when you think about it. But despite all of that, and despite all these differences between the various individuals who represent the manosphere, I think there are some basic common threads that you can extract from this all, and I think that you can also make an assessment as to whether or not anything positive has happened, anything has changed for the better as a result of the manosphere. Now, it goes without saying, as with all things and all phenomena, nothing is ever just solely positive. The manosphere has a lot of negative aspects too. We might be able to talk about some of that. But the fundamental question that I want to ask is whether or not the manosphere has changed anything for the better. Has it achieved some goal? Now, again, it's not like the manosphere is one coherent, cohesive unit. It's not like the manosphere was sitting there were alliances, and everyone was planning things out, and we have these goals to achieve, and we've achieved this goal and that goal, and we're finally done. No, nothing like that, obviously. But collectively, with all the information out there, some of it good, some of it bad, some of it correct, some of it false, has the manosphere changed anything for the better? Okay. Well, has it done that? I think overall, yes. And the reasons for this are pretty complicated. There are a lot of bad actors within the manosphere. There's a lot of bad information. But there's also some good information. And when you compare the lay of the land, the landscape of the internet and broader society, if you will, say 20 plus years ago, compared to now, well, what are the differences? 20 plus years ago, especially 30 years ago, there were a lot of men out there who simply had no clue about how gender relations worked. And yes, there's some people that will claim that they always knew, they always understood, and maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But back in the day, most men were clueless. Because men, as well as women, although women, of course, are a different topic altogether, but collectively men and women, but specifically men, were fed lies, fairy tales, basically to maintain a narrative of, well, this is how it works. Be nice, be kind, be generous, be yourself. And basically the way gender relations work, the way romance works, it's all fairy dust at the end of the day. Stars and fairy dust. It's just magic. And somehow the magic works for everyone eventually, right? There's an expression in German, every pot has its lid, which is meant to signify there's somebody for everyone. And you would hear this all the time, and you would hear that basically, as long as the magic fairy dust is there, everything will be fine. Nobody talked about the reality that we are basically primates, that we are animals, and that the rules that govern all mating and courtship and reproduction, that govern other primates, that govern other mammals, they govern us too. It's just hidden, very well hidden in fact, beneath a veneer of civilization. And it's this veneer of civilization, the mechanization that accompanies that veneer, that allows us, collectively as a society, to produce the grand illusion, to tell, effectively, lies and fairy tales to men and women about the nature of gender relations. Because it's safe, it's easy, and that's a general thread you can observe everywhere. The safer civilization society becomes, the easier it is to at least attempt to deviate from reality as it actually is. Because apart from gender relation fairy tales, there are all kinds of tall tales that have been told to us. But that's a separate discussion for a separate time. So, under this cover, this veneer of civilization, the safety, the promise that everything is magic, men were told one thing, but their lived experience, a term that I'm not really a fan of because it's been co-opted and abused by far-left progressives to a very, very extreme extent, but the lived experience, if you will, of men told a different story. And I can attest to this as somebody who's very close to 50 these days, specifically that if you observe things that were strange to you, that didn't make sense, that were inappropriate, say, on the part of female behavior, and you made that known, that was a taboo. 30 years ago, you couldn't say anything. Hell, even 25 years ago, you couldn't really say anything. You were a weirdo. And God forbid you point that out. Don't say anything. Keep your mouth shut. Alternatively, you would observe things such as the constant negativity and over-criticism, if you will, of men and what they do in magazines and television and what have you. And again, you couldn't really say anything. You just had to kind of grit your teeth and bear it, smile along and sort of laugh. And at some point in time, as the incipient internet becomes a much more powerful tool for communication, various channels emerge, not just proper channels on YouTube, but channels of communication that begin to inform men, no, actually what you've heard your whole life, what you've been told, that's actually not true. And in fact, your quote-unquote lived experience, what you're observing, that has a lot more truth than you think it does. You've been lied to. Now again, there are plenty of people, especially among academicians for some reason, I don't know why, they really dislike the manosphere, who claim they've always understood gender dynamics. And I guess it makes sense if you are involved in research around evo-psych or gender relations or men and women, and you got involved in that academically, well, it makes sense to me that you would always have recognized that. But most men did not and could not. It is a form of propaganda, going back decades, to describe gender relations and reproductive issues along the lines of Disney-esque fairy tales. And if it were so easy to understand this, there wouldn't have been millions of men who had drunk the Kool-Aid and bought into it. It's just a simple fact. And so the master comes along and shakes things up and says, actually, things are not a fairy tale. They're a lot more grim than you think they are. We are animals. We're primates. We are the fifth ape, or at least I would say we are the fifth ape. And what you've always thought, what you've been told, it's not true. In fact, gender relations are a lot tougher than you think. There are a lot of things that are inherent to our nature as animals that govern them. And more importantly, I think this is a really important point, maybe the most salient point of all, men and women are very different in certain regards. Yes, there's a lot of overlap in certain respects, we'll put that out there, but when it comes to reproductive strategy and what's important and what's needed or wanted, men and women are fundamentally different. And that's something that, again, you were never told 30 years ago, even 25 years ago. So if I had to pinpoint one single thing that I think the manosphere has done rather well overall, despite many mistakes having been made, despite many unsavory actors, it is letting the public of men know that gender relations are not as people used to claim they were, and that men and women are very, very different, and you should approach gender relations and reproduction from the perspective of that of an animal, because that's what we are. Now, there are other things that later on down the line enter into the manosphere. You could argue that inkwells are part of the manosphere nominally. I mean, they might not want to be part of the manosphere, but they are nonetheless labeled as part of the manosphere. And then you get added layers, such as the layers of lookism. Lookism being the acknowledgement that your looks play a supreme role when it comes to you navigating the reproductive world, and not just that, the world in general, like the halo effect, right? And that, at least for initial relations, your ability to get your foot in the door and the ability to maintain that initial stage to be found attractive, your looks are all important. And there's no denying that when you actually look at the evidence. And this, of course, again, ran counter to a fairy tale you would hear frequently back in the day, that it's what's on the inside that counts. That's what matters. It's ultimately about your personality. Everything except an acknowledgement that your external being, your looks, are actually supremely important. Everything except that, right? So that was another added dimension of the manosphere contributing something that changed the perception of broader society, changed their perception, at least online, of things. And again, I'm not sure if inkwells are happy to be classified as part of the manosphere, but I think people just do it de facto, so it is what it is. I think those two main factors, those two main features, looks being supremely important for basically everything in your life, especially the reproductive game and gender relations, and the fact that behaviorally, psychologically, men and women are very, very different and want different things from relationships, and in general from the world, if you extrapolate from that. Those are probably the two broadest contributions of the manosphere. And a lot of people who are young just take this as basic knowledge, like 2 + 2 = 4, like they've always known this. Well, yes, there might have been a point in time 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago where this was obvious, and to varying degrees you could argue that that was the case. But under the mirage and the veneer of the fairy tales that people had been fed, such as it's what's on the inside that counts, or love is predicated on some ineffable quality that exists within your heart but is nonetheless non-material, or something like that, right? Before all this stuff had been clarified and explained to people, it was not a given. And so when I look back at the manosphere, for all its many flaws, and there are a lot of flaws, and there are a lot of unsavory people that I personally would not get along with, if I'm perfectly honest, a lot of egomaniacs, for example, and if there's anything I can't stand, it is egotism, but again, that's part and parcel of the internet. Regardless of whether it's the manosphere or not, there are a lot of egomaniacs. But at the end of the day, those two things, the concept of lookism and the concept of fundamental differences in human psychology between men and women, and how extrapolating from that, men and women act differently, behave differently towards each other, towards the world. They have different interests in terms of what they want from the world. Well, those are probably the two biggest contributions of the manosphere. Now, you can argue, and I think a lot of academicians would, that the manosphere stole all of that from academia. And to varying degrees, that's kind of true. But the term theft is a bit weird because knowledge has always been passed on and recycled. There's nothing new under the sun, not really. It's been absorbed, it has been reapplied, and has been reified in various incarnations. I'm talking about knowledge here. So the idea that some bad actors in the manosphere simply stole information or knowledge or data from academics, specifically people within evo-psych, or in psychology more broadly, or within evolutionary biology, that's probably not true. Now, you could argue that they misinterpreted the data, sure, but here's my point and my response to this. But if I were to respond to this, it would be pretty simple. When you have a media apparatus that is producing fairy tales in terms of quote-unquote information instead of actual data that maps onto reality, and men are eating this up, and women for that matter, arguably even more so, about the nature of human beings and human gender relations, if it has been cooked up a bunch of fairy tales to make people feel good even though it doesn't really do anything in reality, and academics in their ivory tower are not willing to be public science communicators and inform people and inform the broader public, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to get people, some of them are bad actors, some of them are not, who are going to take the information, understand it and interpret it as best as they can, and distribute it and make it known. So it might be sad on some level that some non-academics out there, myself included, have used information from evo-psych or evolutionary biology to make people aware and share knowledge. But what do you expect? Academics, broadly speaking, not just those within evo-psych or evo-biology, have never been particularly forthcoming or interactive with the public when it came to their domains of knowledge and their domains of study. They're very often arrogant, and they very often look down upon non-academics, and so why would they share this information to begin with? So at the end of the day, imperfect as the transmission might have been, it's better than academics just hanging around in their ivory towers, jerking off to each other and their own papers to have this information out there. So average people, average men, and hell yeah, why not? average women can understand the profound gender differences that we have on hand, as well as other things such as the importance of looks, etc., etc. Halo effect, phalo effect. If you're not willing to spread that information to the public so they can make good use of it, so they're informed and knowledgeable, and they can lead better lives as a consequence, then what are you doing other than producing papers to impress each other mutually within the academic sphere that you already work in, which is all fine and good, but I like to think of knowledge as a tool for improving human conditions, and that's my perspective on that. Anyway, at the end of the day, I do think the manosphere has changed things more or less for the better. There have been some bumps in the road. Obviously, as I've said, unsavory actors, but the core principles, the core bits of knowledge that have been spread out to the far corners of the internet, and as a consequence, outside of the internet, well, I think that has overall, on balance, been a positive thing. But anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my very generous patrons on Patreon, and my generous donors on PayPal. You guys are the best. Without you, this channel could not exist. Thank you so much. And if you can hit the bell icon to be informed of my videos, let you know when the videos are up, be much appreciated. Like the video, share, comment, subscribe. If you're not yet subbed, be much appreciated as well. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. Until the next time, may the gods truly watch over you. Bye-bye for now.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.